didn't see it coming, or maybe you did and couldn't stop it. Either way, you woke up one day and everything that used to hold you together was gone. The identity, the certainty, the sense that you knew who you were and where you were going. Gone. And what was left wasn't grief exactly. It was something worse. It was blankness. The terrifying absence of a self that used to feel solid. Maybe it was a relationship that ended and took your entire sense of reality with it. Maybe it was a career collapse that didn't just cost you a job, but cost you a reason to exist. Maybe it was depression so deep it didn't feel like sadness. It felt like erasure. Or maybe there was no single event. Just a slow accumulation of pressure until one day the structure gave way and you found yourself in the rubble, unable to explain what happened or who you are now. This is where most people make the first mistake. They treat the collapse as a problem to be solved as quickly as possible. Get back on your feet, rebuild, move forward. And underneath that urgency is a single, unexamined assumption that who you were before the collapse is who you should return to. That recovery means restoration, that the goal is to reconstruct what fell. Carl Jung would call that the most dangerous thing you can do. Jung knew collapse from the inside. After his break with Freud, the man he had called his mentor, his father figure, the center of his intellectual world, he entered years of profound disorientation. He described feeling suspended in midair. He had visions he couldn't explain, dreams that terrified him, an inner world that felt like it was coming apart. By most external measures, he was failing. By his own account, he was descending. But Jung didn't try to stop the descent. He followed it. He documented it, drew it, wrote it, sat with it for years. And what emerged on the other side wasn't a restored version of the man who had broken with Freud. It was something altogether new. A psychology, a framework for human transformation, an understanding of the psyche that would define his life's work. The collapse wasn't the interruption of his path. It was the path. "My life," he wrote, "is a story of the self-realization of the unconscious. Not a story of success, not a story of recovery, a story of the unconscious forcing its way into consciousness, whether you invite it or not. What you are living through is not a malfunction. It is the psyche doing exactly what it was designed to do, destroying what was false so that something true can finally exist. The question isn't how to stop it. The question is whether you have the courage to understand what it's trying to say and what it's asking you to become. That process begins where you least want to look, at the identity that just collapsed, and at exactly how much of you was never really there. Here is the thing no one tells you about emotional collapse. Most of the time, what breaks isn't you. It's the version of you that you built for other people to see. Jung called it the persona, from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theatre. The persona is the face you constructed to navigate the social world, the competent professional, the devoted partner, the person who has it together, the version of yourself that earned approval, respect, or simply the absence of rejection. Every person builds one. That's not pathology. That's adaptation. The problem comes later, when the adaptation becomes the identity. When you stop wearing the mask and start believing you are the mask. Jung watched this happen in patient after patient. A man who had defined himself entirely through professional success found that when the career collapsed, there was nothing underneath. Not a wounded person. Nothing. No preferences, no desires, no sense of what he actually valued. Just absence. Because for decades, the persona had been doing all the living, and the actual self had been quietly starving in the background. This is the specific cruelty of persona collapse. It doesn't feel like losing a role. It feels like dying. And in a very real psychological sense, something is dying. Just not what you think. What dies is the structure you mistook for yourself. The grief is real. The disorientation is real. But what you're mourning isn't yourself. You're mourning the mask and the terrible comfort of knowing exactly who you were supposed to be. Think about what preceded your collapse. How much of your daily life was organized around maintaining an image of competence, of strength, of being the person others needed you to be? How much energy went into the performance, into sustaining the version of yourself that the world had come to expect? And beneath that performance, what was there? If you're honest, maybe not much. Maybe a person who had stopped asking what they actually wanted because the question felt dangerous or selfish or simply irrelevant to the life they had built. Jung was unsparing about this. He wrote that the greater the inflation of the persona, the more completely a person identifies with their social role, the more catastrophic its collapse becomes, not because they lose more, but because they had less to begin with. The persona was covering an emptiness that had been growing for years. The collapse didn't create that emptiness. It revealed it. And this is where the real work begins. Not in rebuilding the mask faster, not in finding a new role to inhabit, but in sitting with the question that the collapse has finally made unavoidable. Who are you when there is no performance required? Not who you were trained to be, not who others needed you to be. Who are you when the theater is empty and the mask is on the floor? That question is not rhetorical. It has an answer. But finding it requires something most people spend their entire lives avoiding: a genuine descent into what lies underneath. What that descent looks like, and why most people refuse it, is exactly what we need to examine next. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. Your collapse didn't begin on the day everything fell apart. It began months earlier, maybe years. There were signals, small ones at first, then louder. You ignored them, or managed them, or reframed them as the normal cost of the life you had chosen, until the system ran out of room to compensate, and the whole thing came down at once. Jung didn't believe in psychological accidents. He believed the psyche was purposeful, not in a mystical sense, but in a structural one. Symptoms don't appear randomly. Depression, burnout, identity crisis, the sudden inability to keep functioning. These are not failures of willpower. They are communications, the unconscious speaking in the only language left to it after everything else was ignored. The question worth asking, and most people never ask it, is not, why did this happen to me? That question keeps you passive, positioned as a victim of circumstances. The real question is, what was I refusing to see? Because the collapse almost always arrives at the exact point where the gap between the life you were living and the life that was true to you became too wide to sustain. Sometimes that gap was built from external pressure. A career chosen to satisfy a parent's ambitions, a relationship maintained for fear of being alone, a persona constructed so early and so thoroughly that you genuinely forgot there was a person underneath it. Sometimes the gap was built from internal suppression, decades of swallowed anger, unacknowledged needs, desires you deemed unacceptable and buried deep enough that you stopped feeling them altogether. Jung called this the shadow. Everything you rejected about yourself pushed into the unconscious, where it continued to exert pressure whether you acknowledged it or not. Shadow material doesn't disappear when you refuse to look at it. It accumulates. It finds indirect expression, in chronic tension, in inexplicable sadness, in the faint but persistent sense that something is wrong without any identifiable cause. And when the pressure becomes great enough, it doesn't ask permission. It erupts. Depression is frequently not emptiness. It is rage with nowhere to go. Burnout is frequently not exhaustion. It is a self that has been performing a life it cannot sustain. Before his own collapse, Jung had spent years living inside an identity built around his relationship with Freud. The dutiful intellectual heir, the crown prince of psychoanalysis. It was a role with enormous professional and personal weight attached to it. And it was, in fundamental ways, not true. His actual thinking was diverging. His actual questions led somewhere Freud couldn't follow. But the cost of that truth felt too high for too long. And so he carried the tension until he couldn't. What he wrote afterward was precise. The parting with Freud was not just a professional rupture. It was a confrontation with everything he had suppressed about his own direction, his own nature, his own psychology. The external collapse was the surface event. The real crisis was internal and had been building for years. Your collapse has the same structure. Something in you knew before you did. The signs were there. The growing dissatisfaction, the symptoms that appeared before the breaking point, the part of you that was exhausted not by circumstance, but by the constant effort of sustaining something false. The collapse didn't betray you. It was the most honest thing your psyche had done in years, which means the path forward isn't around what happened, it's through it. And the first step of that passage, the one most people refuse entirely, is the deliberate descent into exactly what you've been avoiding. Every instinct you have right now is telling you to move forward, get back to functioning, rebuild momentum, find a new direction, and pursue it with enough velocity that you don't have to feel what's underneath. This instinct feels like resilience. It is not. It is the same avoidance mechanism that produced the collapse, now operating under a different name. Jung recognized this pattern with clinical precision. After the break with Freud, he could have done what most people do, redirected his energy outward, found new professional alliances, rebuilt his reputation through productivity. Instead, he did something that looked, from the outside, like falling apart. He withdrew. He played with stones on the lakeshore like a child. He sat with his visions instead of dismissing them. He descended deliberately into the interior, not knowing what he would find, not knowing if he would return intact. He called it the confrontation with the unconscious. It lasted years. What Jung understood, and what most psychology fails to say clearly enough, is that transformation is not a surface process. You cannot think your way to a new self. You cannot optimize or schedule or discipline yourself into becoming someone fundamentally different. The psyche doesn't work that way. Change at the level that collapse demands requires going down before you go forward. It requires sitting in the ruins long enough to understand what they are made of. This is the descent, and it is not dramatic in the way people imagine. It doesn't require a wilderness retreat, or a spiritual crisis, or a complete dismantling of your life. It requires something harder, the willingness to stop performing recovery and start actually examining what collapsed and why. To ask the questions you have been structuring your entire life around not asking. Who was I really before the roles I inhabited? What did I actually feel in that relationship, that career, that identity, when I was honest with myself at 3 a.m? What did I keep pushing down because there was no acceptable place for it to go? Jung did this through dreams, through what he called active imagination, a practice of consciously engaging with the images that arose from the unconscious, treating them not as symptoms to be eliminated, but as messengers to be understood. He wrote in the Red Book for years, not for publication, not for an audience, but because the process of externalizing the interior was itself the work. The writing was not about the descent. It was the descent. You don't need to replicate his method, but you need to find your version of it. The journal you actually write in, honestly, not the one where you perform insight. The therapy, where you stop managing the therapist's perception of you and start saying the things you've never said out loud. The silence where you stop filling every unstructured hour with stimulation, because the stimulation is a way of staying on the surface. The descent is uncomfortable in a specific way that is different from ordinary pain. Ordinary pain has an object, something that hurt you, someone who failed you, a loss you can name. The discomfort of descent is more like vertigo, because what you encounter on the way down is not a wound with clean edges. It is the accumulated weight of everything you have been carrying without acknowledging it. The unlived life, the self you kept postponing, the truth you agreed not to see in exchange for stability. Jung emerged from his years of descent not because he found answers, but because he found something more durable, the capacity to hold the questions without being destroyed by them. He built the tower at Bollingen with his own hands, stone by stone, as a physical act of inner work, making the interior visible, giving the unconscious a form it could inhabit. The building was not a metaphor. It was the work itself, made concrete. You are at the beginning of that work, and the deepest obstacle you will face is not the darkness waiting in the descent. It is the part of yourself that emerged through the collapse, the part you have spent years keeping out of sight. That is what we need to face directly now. What came up during your collapse? The rage, the neediness, the envy, the grief you couldn't explain, the parts of yourself that felt ugly or embarrassing or simply too much. That wasn't the disease. That was the diagnosis. And most people, the moment they start to stabilize, do exactly the wrong thing. They push it back down. Jung spent decades mapping what he called the shadow, not evil in a moral sense, but everything the conscious self has refused to integrate. The qualities deemed unacceptable by your family, your culture, your own internal censor. The anger you were taught made you difficult. The ambition you suppressed because it seemed arrogant. The vulnerability you buried because it felt like weakness. The needs you denied because having them made you feel like a burden. None of it disappeared. It went underground, where it continued to shape your behavior, your relationships, your choices, invisibly, which made it far more powerful than if you had simply acknowledged it. Collapse forces the shadow to the surface, not gently. Depression reveals the vulnerability you spent years performing your way around. Burnout reveals the limits you denied in service of an identity built on invulnerability. The end of a relationship reveals the needs you never expressed because expressing them felt too dangerous. Whatever came up in your collapse, whatever you felt that you immediately judged as wrong or weak or shameful, that is precisely the material you need to examine, not suppress again. Jung was unambiguous about this. What you refuse to make conscious will run your life from the outside. The shadow doesn't stop operating because you stop looking at it. It operates through projection. You see in others what you cannot tolerate in yourself. It operates through compulsion. The behaviors you can't explain, the patterns you can't break, the reactions that seem disproportionate to what triggered them. Every time you've been inexplicably furious at someone else's neediness, you were looking at your own. Every time you've despised someone's weakness, you were defending against your own. The integration Jung described is not a therapeutic exercise. It is an act of radical honesty. It requires sitting with what the collapse exposed and saying, not as performance, not as confession, but as simple acknowledgement. Yes, this is also me. The person who is not always strong. The person who has needs that weren't being met. The person who was angrier than they admitted, lonelier than they showed, more lost than the persona allowed. This acknowledgement doesn't make you less. It makes you whole in a way the persona never could, because the persona was always incomplete. A careful selection of acceptable qualities presented to the world while everything else was managed out of sight. Integration means expanding the definition of who you are to include what you actually are. Not the curated version, the full one. Jung wrote from direct experience here. His own confrontation with his shadow, the grandiosity, the need for authority, the parts of himself that had been too eager to be Freud's chosen heir, was not comfortable. It was humiliating in the specific way that genuine self-knowledge always is. But what he found on the other side of that humiliation was not diminishment. It was solidity. a self that could stand on its own ground because it was no longer spending half its energy keeping the shadow from breaking through. That solidity is what makes genuine reconstruction possible, not the frantic reassembly of a new persona to replace the one that collapsed, but the slow, deliberate building of something that can actually hold, because this time it is built on what is real. What that construction requires, and what most people get catastrophically wrong when they attempt it, is exactly where we need to go next. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Most people who survive a collapse rebuild immediately, and most of them collapse again. Not because they lack resilience, not because life is cruel, though it is, but because they rebuild on the same foundations that failed the first time. The same unexamined assumptions about what makes a life worth living, the same external anchors for internal worth, the same fundamental refusal to accept certain truths about existence that no amount of productivity or achievement or connection can permanently outrun. Jung watched this happen with a kind of clinical grief. Patients would work through a crisis, stabilize, return to functioning, and within years be back in his office with a new collapse built on identical architecture. The content had changed, the structure hadn't. They had renovated the house without examining whether the foundation could hold weight. The foundations that fail are always variations of the same few illusions. The illusion that your value is located in what you produce, achieve, or inspire in others, so that when performance falters, the self falters with it. The illusion of invulnerability, that if you are disciplined enough, careful enough, strong enough, you can construct a life immune to loss, illness, failure, death. The illusion that living for an audience is the same as living, that the approval of others constitutes a self, that the life others find impressive is the life worth having. These illusions are not stupidity. They are the default architecture of a culture that has never seriously grappled with finitude. Jung argued that one of the central psychological tasks of adult life, particularly the second half, is the confrontation with mortality. Not as an intellectual acknowledgement, but as a lived reality that reshapes priorities. Most people never do it. They manage the awareness of death rather than integrating it, which means they spend their lives building structures designed to deny what cannot be denied. And those structures inevitably collapse under the weight of reality. What does it mean to build on truth instead? It means anchoring your sense of worth in something that cannot be taken by circumstance. Not in the job that can be lost, the relationship that can end, the reputation that can dissolve overnight. Jung pointed toward what he called the self, not the ego, not the persona, but the deeper organizing principle of the psyche, the totality of who you are, including everything the ego has rejected. Building toward the self means building inward, not outward. It means the question that drives reconstruction is not, what can I achieve, but what is actually true about who I am, and what kind of life does that truth require? This is slower. It is less legible to the outside world. A person reconstructing their life around authentic values rather than impressive ones will often look, from the outside, like they are doing less. They may be. What they are doing is building something that will hold. The specific lies worth examining are yours, not generic, but they tend to cluster around the same territories. The belief that needing others is weakness. The belief that your worth is conditional on continued performance. The belief that authenticity is a luxury you can afford after you've secured everything else. The belief that the version of yourself others approved of was the real one, and that what the collapse revealed was aberration rather than truth. Jung built the tower at Bollingen without electricity, without running water, chopping his own wood, cooking his own food. not as asceticism, as a practice of contact with what was real and immediate, and his, stripped of the professional identity, the public reputation, the intellectual authority. He wrote that those simple acts made him simple, that simplicity was not deprivation. It was the recovery of a self that had nearly been consumed by its own achievements. You don't need a tower, but you need the equivalent, some practice, some space, some honest territory, where the persona is not required, and the question of who you actually are can be asked without the answer needing to impress anyone. Because what you build next will only hold if it is built for you, not for the audience that watched the collapse, not to prove that you recovered, for the self that survived it, the one that is still waiting underneath everything that fell, to finally be given room to exist. That self is not who you were before the collapse. It is something the collapse made possible, and what it looks like when it finally emerges, and what it demands of you, is the last thing we need to say. There is a word Jung used that most people misunderstand: individuation. It sounds like individualism, the pursuit of independence, self-sufficiency, the removal of all external constraint. It means almost the opposite. Individuation is the process of becoming wholly and specifically yourself, not the self the world shaped, not the self the persona performed, but the self that was always there underneath the accumulation of adaptations, compromises, and strategic omissions. It is not freedom from others. It is the achievement of a genuine interior, a self solid enough to be in relation with others without disappearing into them. Jung was clear that most people never complete this process, not because they lack the capacity, but because it requires something most people are unwilling to pay: the death of the self they already know. This is the hardest truth of everything we have examined. You are not going to recover from your collapse. Recovery implies return, going back to a previous state, restoring what was lost. What Jung's framework describes is not recovery, it is transformation. And transformation requires that something die completely before something new can exist. The self that collapsed, the one organized around the persona, sustained by illusions, running on suppressed shadow material, that self cannot be the foundation of what comes next. It has to be released, not fixed, not upgraded, released. Most people cannot do this. They get close, they do the work, they descend, they examine the shadow, they begin to feel the outline of something more authentic, and then they flinch, because the new self is unfamiliar, and unfamiliar feels like wrong, because the people in their lives knew the old self and may not recognize or welcome this one. Because authenticity, in practice, is not the peaceful arrival it sounds like in theory. It is disorienting, and often lonely, at least at first. Jung wrote from his own experience that the years following his collapse were among the most isolating of his life. He had lost his professional community. His ideas were not yet formed enough to stand in public. He was, by any conventional measure, failing. And yet, he described those years as the most important of his life, the period from which everything that mattered actually emerged. What emerged was not a restored version of the man who had broken with Freud. It was someone new, someone who had faced the interior and was no longer running from it, someone whose work was grounded not in borrowed authority but in direct psychological experience. The collapse had not interrupted his life's work. It had made it possible. This is what waits on the other side of genuine individuation. Not happiness in any simple sense, not the absence of pain or loss or difficulty, but a kind of solidity, a self that knows what it is, that is no longer held hostage by the fear of being seen as insufficient, that can hold contradiction and uncertainty without collapsing under them. Jung called this the capacity to hold the tension of opposites, to be strong and vulnerable simultaneously, to live with meaning and absurdity at once, to act with conviction while accepting that much is beyond your control. That capacity is not given, it is built. and it is built precisely through what you are living through now. So here is what that building actually requires, not as inspiration, but as practice. First, stop measuring your progress by external reconstruction. The new job, the new relationship, the return to productivity. These are not evidence that the work is done. They are neutral. What matters is whether the interior has changed. Second, continue the descent even when stability returns. The temptation, once you can function again, is to stop examining. Don't. The stabilization is not the destination. It is the platform from which the real work continues. Third, when the shadow material surfaces, the anger, the need, the grief, the parts of yourself you find difficult, do not manage it back into silence. Write it down. Say it out loud to someone who can hold it. Let it exist in consciousness long enough to be understood. Fourth, make one decision, however small, that is true to the self the collapse revealed, rather than the self the collapse destroyed. Not a dramatic gesture, a single, honest choice about how you spend your time, what you say yes to, what you finally refuse. That choice is the first stone of the new foundation. The work does not end here. It cannot end here, because individuation is not a destination. It is the direction of a life. What you carry forward from this collapse, how you use what it revealed, whether you build on truth or reconstruct the illusion. That is the question your psyche has been trying to ask you for longer than you know. You have heard it now. What you do with it is yours entirely. If something in this video named something you have been carrying alone, leave it in the comments. And when you are ready, the work that begins here does not end with a single conversation. There is more to face, and you already know it.